Eleanor Graves threw the contract back across the table so hard it slid off the edge and hit the floor. "Get out!" Gerald Pruitt didn't move. He just smiled that patient, practiced smile of a man who had never once been told no and believed it. "Mrs. Graves, I'm offering you twice what the land is worth. I said get out of my house. If you want to know why a woman chooses hunger over help, stay with me to the very end. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels." Gerald Pruitt picked the contract up off the floor with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who considered himself generous for not raising his voice. He folded it once, tucked it into the breast pocket of his coat, and set his hat back on his head like a man concluding a business meeting that had gone exactly as planned. Not like a man who had just been thrown out of someone's home. "You'll change your mind," he said. "Winter's coming, Mrs. Graves. A woman alone out here doesn't last long once the cold settles in." Eleanor held the door open. Her arm was shaking not from fear, but from the effort of not saying everything she was thinking. "Goodbye, Mr. Pruitt." He walked out. She closed the door behind him. And then she stood with her back pressed against it, both hands flat against the wood, and breathed. Outside she heard his horse pull away. She heard the creak of his buggy wheels on the frozen ground. She heard the sound of him leaving, which was the only thing about Gerald Pruitt she had ever liked. Then she walked to the window and looked out at what she had. The north fence was down again. She could see it from the house. 3 rails collapsed, leaning against each other like tired old men. 2 of her remaining cattle had already wandered toward the gap. She would have to go out and move them back before dark, restring the wire with hands that already ached from the cold, and do it all before the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. She was 41 years old. She had been doing this alone for 2 years. She went to get her coat. Sure. Clearwater, Colorado had opinions about Eleanor Graves. This was not unusual. Clearwater had opinions about everyone, but Eleanor had earned a particular category of town commentary, the kind reserved for women who refused to behave in ways that made other people comfortable. Proud, some said. This was the polite version. Stubborn, others said. This was the version with an edge to it. Foolish bunny, said the ones who had watched her turn down 3 separate offers on her land. In the past 18 months, offers that would have paid off her debt to the Clearwater Savings and Loan and left her with enough to start over somewhere smaller, somewhere easier. Somewhere she might not freeze to death trying to prove a point. Eleanor knew what they said. She had heard enough of it at the general store at the post office, through the thin walls of Doc Hartley's waiting room, when she'd gone in for her hand last February, after a wire fence had sliced it open down to the bone. "That Graves woman is going to lose everything," she'd heard Agnes Colton say, to someone her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a person whose predictions had been correct before. "And she'll have no one to blame but herself." Eleanor had sat behind that curtain and pressed the cloth harder against her bleeding hand and thought, at least it will be myself. That was the thing no one in Clearwater quite understood. They talked about her pride like it was a character flaw, like it was something she was doing to be difficult. They didn't understand that it wasn't pride at all. It was memory. James Graves had been charming too. That was the thing about it. He had been so charming, so certain, so full of ideas about how things should go. And Eleanor had been 24 years old and completely convinced that certainty in a man was the same thing as trustworthiness. She had learned the difference. She had learned it slowly, the way you learn most painful things, not in one sharp moment, but across years of small moments that each seemed survivable on their own. A decision made without consulting her. A contract signed with her name on it that she hadn't read until after. A boundary crossed so gently that she hadn't been sure at first whether it had been crossed at all. James hadn't been cruel. That was what made it so hard to explain. He hadn't raised his hand to her, hadn't raised his voice much, hadn't done any of the dramatic, terrible things that would have given her a clean story to tell. He had simply treated the ranch, the money, and Eleanor herself as things that belonged to him, and done it so consistently and so quietly that by the time she understood what had happened, she had forgotten what it felt like to make a decision that was fully her own. When he died of a fever 2 winters ago, Eleanor had grieved. She had genuinely grieved. And then, 3 weeks after the funeral, she had sat down at the kitchen table with every piece of paper she could find and started reading. She'd found the debt then. All of it. $6,000 borrowed against the land spread across 2 different banks, payments 2 months behind. She'd found the bill of sale for the south pasture that she hadn't known he'd sold. She'd found the lien on the cattle. She had sat at that table for a long time, and when she got up, she had made herself a single promise: never again. Not never love, not never trust. Those were promises she'd known she couldn't keep, and she didn't make promises she couldn't keep. Just never again would she hand anyone the paperwork to her own life and trust them not to fill it in wrong. The north fence took her an hour and a half. By the time she'd moved the cattle back and restrung the wire, her fingers had gone past cold into something closer to wooden, that numb mechanical state where she could still move them, but couldn't quite feel what she was doing. She worked by instinct and stubbornness, and got it done. Walking back to the house, she did the arithmetic she did every evening now. It was not a pleasant arithmetic. The banknote came due in March. She had 4 months. At current prices, her remaining cattle, 14 head down from 31 when James died, would cover maybe a third of what she owed. The hay she'd put up in September would last until February if the winter was mild, January if it wasn't. She had 2 horses, a broken-down plow, and about $70 in actual cash money, which sounded like something until you counted what she needed to buy before spring. She had thought about selling the south parcel, the one James had sold without telling her, and then quietly bought back at twice the price, a transaction she still didn't fully understand. It would cover the note. But it would also take away the only reliable water access to the east pasture, which meant the east pasture became worthless, which meant she was right back where she started, except with less land. She thought about taking in laundry. She thought about it seriously for about 4 minutes until she calculated that she would need to wash approximately 400 shirts between now and March to make the numbers work. She thought about the offer from Gerald Pruitt because she made herself think about it honestly, made herself look at the numbers without flinching. Twice the land value, enough to pay the debt, buy a small house in town, have something left over. And then she thought about what Gerald Pruitt would do with the Graves Ranch. She thought about his name on the deed where hers was. She thought about walking past this land in 5 years and seeing his fences, his cattle, his hired hands working ground that her grandfather had broken. She went inside and put the kettle on. The next morning brought 2 visitors before 9 o'clock, which was 2 more than Eleanor wanted. The first was Roy Lester, who ran the feed store and was not a bad man, but had a habit of arriving at inconvenient moments with unsolicited advice. He came to tell her that he'd heard Pruitt had been out to see her, and that Pruitt was telling people in town she'd be sold out from under by February. "He's saying that," Eleanor said. "He's saying a lot of things." Roy shifted his weight. He had the look of a man who had been asked to deliver a message he wasn't sure he should deliver. "He's saying the bank's going to foreclose before spring, and that when they do, he's first in line to buy. He can get in line all he wants. The note doesn't come due until March." Eleanor. Roy said her name the way people said it when they were about to say something uncomfortable. "I heard from Bill Danvers over at the Savings and Loan that Pruitt's been talking to them. I don't know what kind of talking, but what kind of talking, Roy? The kind where money changes hands and arrangements get made." He looked at his boots. "I thought you should know." After he left, Eleanor stood in the yard for a long moment. The cold was sharp and clean, and she breathed it in slowly, trying to think. If Pruitt had already gotten to the bank, if he'd made some arrangement with Danvers to accelerate the note or change the terms, she had less time than she thought. She needed to talk to Danvers herself. She needed to read every piece of paper she'd signed when she'd taken over James's debt, every clause, every condition. She went inside to find the documents. She was still reading when the second visitor arrived. The knock at the door was quiet. Not hesitant, just quiet. The knock of someone who wasn't sure they were welcome and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Eleanor opened the door with a land contract in one hand and her reading glasses still on, and found herself looking at a man she had never seen before. He was tall, not imposingly so, but enough that he had to angle slightly to meet her eye. His coat was worn at the elbows. His hat was plain. He had the kind of face that didn't advertise anything in particular, not warmth, not coldness, not the practiced pleasantness of a man trying to sell something. He looked like someone who spent most of his time outdoors and had stopped worrying about what his face was doing a long time ago. He held his hat in both hands. "Mrs. Graves?" "That's right. My name is Nathan Hale. I have the property about 6 miles east of here, the old Kavanaugh place." Eleanor knew the Kavanaugh place. She also knew it had been empty for 3 years. "I've been settling in since August," he said, as if he'd read her thought. "I'm not here to bother you. I just wanted to introduce myself since we're neighbors." Eleanor looked at him. She had become very good at looking at men, at reading the thing underneath the thing they were saying, the angle of approach, the strategy hidden inside the courtesy. She couldn't find one, which made her more suspicious, not less. "That's a long ride to introduce yourself," she said. "I was coming into Clearwater for supplies anyway. What do you want, Mr. Hale?" He didn't flinch. "I told you, to introduce myself. Most people who ride out to introduce themselves want something." "Most people, maybe." He put his hat back on. "I heard you were having a hard season. I'm not offering help. I just wanted you to know there was a neighbor nearby if you needed one." Eleanor waited for the rest of it. The offer, the angle, the price attached to the neighborliness. It didn't come. "Good day, Mrs. Graves," he said, and turned and walked back to his horse. She stood in the doorway and watched him ride out the contract, still in her hand, her reading glasses still on her face. She didn't know what to make of him. That bothered her more than she expected. She found what she needed in the documents that night, buried in the 3rd page of a rider attached to the original loan agreement, the kind of clause that was designed to be missed. It allowed the bank to call the note early if the property value declined by more than 20%, as assessed by a bank-appointed appraiser. Eleanor read it twice. Then she read it a 3rd time. Then she understood what Gerald Pruitt had been doing. He hadn't been waiting for March. He'd been engineering a different outcome, an appraisal one he had probably already arranged with an appraiser he had probably already spoken to, that would show the Graves ranch had declined in value. The broken fences, the reduced cattle count, the unmaintained outbuildings. All of it would be on paper. All of it would be defensible. And once the appraisal came in low enough, the bank could call the note. Not in March. Whenever they wanted. Eleanor put the document down and looked at the wall for a while. She thought about what she had. 14 cattle, a broken plow, $70, 4 months she'd thought she had, and maybe didn't. She thought about the north fence that had taken her an hour and a half to fix and would probably be down again by Thursday. She thought about what it would mean to lose this land. Not just financially, she had done the financial arithmetic so many times it had lost its ability to frighten her. She thought about what it would mean. The name on the deed, the ground under her feet, the thing she had refused to let anyone take. She sat there until the lamp started to flicker and the fire burned low, and then she got up and put more wood on and made herself go to bed. She didn't sleep much, but she got up in the morning. She always got up in the morning. She drove into Clearwater the next day and sat across from Bill Danvers at the Savings and Loan and put the contract on the desk between them. "Tell me about the appraisal clause," she said. Danvers was a small man with careful eyes. He looked at the contract. He looked at Eleanor. He didn't look particularly surprised that she'd found it. "It's standard language, Mrs. Graves. Has an appraisal been requested?" A pause. Just a half-second pause, but Eleanor had learned to read half-seconds. "I'm not at liberty to—" "Bill." She leaned forward. "We have known each other for 16 years. Your children went to school with mine. I am asking you directly, has Gerald Pruitt asked for an appraisal of my property?" Danvers looked at his hands. I can't discuss other customers' business. Which was Eleanor understood the answer. She picked up the contract. What would I need to do to cure a default under this clause? If an appraisal came in low, what are my options? You could dispute the appraisal. Hire your own appraiser. That costs money. Yes. What else? You could bring the property value up, make improvements, but a counter-appraisal would need to be requested within 30 days of the bank's appraisal being delivered. And when is the bank's appraisal being delivered? Another pause. Danvers's jaw moved slightly. Bill, Eleanor said quietly. When? End of the month, he said, not looking at her. That's all I can tell you. Eleanor had 12 days. She drove home with that number sitting in her chest like a stone, and when she got back to the ranch, she walked the entire property, all of it, every fence line, every outbuilding, every piece of infrastructure that was broken or failing, and made a list. It was a long list. She looked at it and did the arithmetic of time and money and physical capacity. One woman, 12 days limited cash, a body that already ached from 2 years of this. The numbers didn't work. She knew it before she finished the calculation. But she started anyway. She began with the most visible damage, the things an appraiser would photograph first. The collapsed section of the east barn wall, the broken gate on the main corral, the roof over the tack room that had been leaking since October and had spread a dark stain down the interior wall that looked at a glance like the kind of rot that brought a structure's value down significantly. She worked through the first 2 days without stopping for much. She ate standing up. She slept in pieces 4 hours 5 if she was lucky. Her hands were doing that thing they did when she pushed them past what they could comfortably do, where the cold settled into the joints and didn't entirely leave even when she came inside. On the 3rd day, her neighbor appeared. She was on top of the corral gate, trying to rehang it on hinges that were bent past where they should have been able to function, and she heard a horse come into the yard and looked down and saw Nathan Hale sitting easy in the saddle watching her. "You need another pair of hands on that," he said. "I'm managing." "You've been at it for 20 minutes. I watched from the road." Eleanor looked at him. "You were watching me from the road." "I was passing on the road," he said. "And then I stopped because it looked like you needed help." "I don't need help." "Mrs. Graves." His voice was even, not impatient, not cajoling, just even. "That gate is going to come down on you. The top hinge is bent at the wrong angle. When you get it close to seated, the weight's going to shift and it's going to drop. I've done this enough times to know." Eleanor looked at the hinge. She looked at the angle of it. She looked down at Nathan Hale and hated that he was right. "I'll hold the gate," she said finally. "You fix the hinge." He got off his horse without another word, tied it to the fence post, and climbed up beside her. He didn't say anything about how she should be doing it, didn't take over, didn't offer opinions about what else needed to be fixed. He looked at the hinge, pulled a tool from his coat pocket, a thing Eleanor recognized as a hinge pin she hadn't been able to find, and got to work. 40 minutes later, the gate was hung. Nathan climbed down. Eleanor climbed down. They stood on either side of it, and she swung it open and closed twice, testing the action. "It'll hold," he said. "Thank you," she said. She meant it as a dismissal. He seemed to understand that because he nodded and walked back to his horse. And then he stopped. "I'm not going to ask you anything," he said, not turning around. "But I ride this road most mornings. If you have something you need an extra set of hands on, you can flag me down, that's all." He got on his horse and rode out. Eleanor stood by the gate and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was the particular loneliness of watching someone ride away when you needed help but couldn't ask for it. She went back to work. What? By day 6, she had repaired the gate, patched the barn wall, and gotten the tack room roof stopped up enough that no new damage was spreading. She had also discovered 2 things she hadn't known about a section of the south fence that had been compromised by something: an animal, a downed tree she couldn't tell, and a problem with the water trough in the east pasture that had apparently been slow leaking for weeks and had turned the ground around it into something treacherous for the cattle. She stood in the east pasture on the morning of day 7 and looked at both problems, and then looked at her hands, and then looked at the sky and said out loud to no one, "This is not going to be enough." No one answered. The wind moved through the dry grass. One of her cattle looked at her with the blank patience of an animal that expected nothing and was therefore never disappointed. Eleanor had 6 days left. She had 2 problems she couldn't fix alone: a body that was starting to file complaints she couldn't ignore, and the beginning of something in her chest that she recognized with deep dread as despair. Not the ordinary daily exhaustion of this life, but the specific cold certainty that the math was not going to work, that she had fought this hard for this long, and it was not going to be enough, and that Gerald Pruitt was going to get her land. She stood there for a long time. Then she heard hooves on the road. She didn't look up right away. She wasn't sure she could trust herself to look at Nathan Hale right now with her face doing whatever it was doing, and the despair sitting openly in her chest where she hadn't had time to put it away properly. But she looked up. He had stopped at the fence line. He wasn't coming in. He was sitting on his horse at the edge of her property, and he was looking at her not with the eager helpfulness of a man waiting to be needed, not with pity, not with the particular expression men got when they thought a woman was about to make things easy for them. He was just looking, the way you looked at someone you were worried about. Eleanor walked to the fence. "I found 2 new problems," she said. "South fence and the east water trough." "I saw the south fence from the road," he said. "Yesterday. I have 6 days before an appraiser comes." She watched him absorb that. Watched him understand what it meant without having to explain the whole story. "What do you need?" he said. Not "let me help," not "I'll take care of it," not any of the versions of that sentence that translated to "now you owe me." Just "what do you need?" Eleanor's throat did something unexpected. She pressed her lips together until it stopped. "I need the south fence by tomorrow," she said, "and the trough fixed before the appraiser sees the east pasture." "All right," Nathan said. He dismounted and tied his horse and came through the gate, and Eleanor showed him the south fence, and they worked side by side in the cold, and he did not make it strange, and she did not thank him more than once, and neither of them talked about anything except the work in front of them. But when he rode out that evening, Eleanor stood at the window and watched him go, and the loneliness was different than it had been before. Before it had been like a wall, something she had built. Now it felt like a door. One she didn't know yet whether she was brave enough to open. She turned away from the window and went to make supper. The ranch was quiet around her. The fire was low. Outside the wind had picked up, and she could hear it moving through the eaves, that sound she had learned to read like a language, the sound of winter settling in, of cold that intended to stay. She was still afraid. She wanted to be honest with herself about that. She was afraid of the appraiser. She was afraid of Pruitt. She was afraid of the bank and the clause and the 30-day window and all the arithmetic that still didn't quite work no matter how many times she ran it. But there was something else now. Something quieter than fear and harder to name. She sat down at the table and pulled out her list. 6 days. The south fence, done the trough to fix 3 more items she hadn't gotten to yet. She made her plan for tomorrow item by item, methodical and clear. And for the first time in 2 years, she was not entirely alone while she did it. She wasn't sure yet what to do with that. She wasn't sure yet whether it was something to hold on to or something to be careful of. But she wrote it down anyway, not on the list, but somewhere in the back of her mind where she kept the things that mattered. A neighbor. A quiet man who asked what she needed instead of telling her what he wanted. 6 days. She picked up her pencil and got back to work. The appraiser arrived on a Tuesday. Eleanor heard the buggy before she saw it, the particular sound of iron wheels on frozen ground moving slowly, the way people moved when they were looking at things rather than going somewhere. She was in the barn when she heard it, and she came out with her work gloves still on, and watched a man she didn't recognize climb down from the buggy with a leather satchel and a measuring rod, and the careful, unhurried manner of someone who was being paid by the hour. Behind his buggy on a separate horse was Gerald Pruitt. Eleanor hadn't expected that. She stood very still for a moment, and made herself breathe. Pruitt didn't dismount right away. He sat on his horse at the edge of her yard and watched the appraiser approach her the way a man watches something he already owns. "Mrs. Graves," the appraiser said, lifting his hat. "I'm Thomas Greer. I've been engaged by Clearwater Savings and Loan to conduct a property assessment. I have authorization here from the bank." He held out a document. Eleanor took it. She read it completely before she said a word, every line, every clause, the signature at the bottom. It was exactly what she'd expected. It was also exactly what she'd dreaded. "How long will this take?" she said. "Most of the day," Greer said. He had a flat professional voice, the voice of a man who had learned to show nothing. "I'll need access to all structures and fence lines." "Fine." Eleanor folded the document and tucked it into her coat pocket. She looked at Pruitt, still on his horse. "He doesn't come on my property." Greer glanced back at Pruitt. Something passed between them, quick practiced, almost invisible. "Mr. Pruitt is here as a—" "He is not on my property." Her voice was quiet and completely final. "Those are my terms. You want access to my land, that man stays at the fence line. Or you don't come in at all, and we sort it out with lawyers." She didn't have a lawyer. But Greer didn't know that. Greer looked at Pruitt again. Pruitt's jaw moved slightly. Then he gave a single nod, the nod of a man recalculating. "Very well," Greer said. Eleanor put her gloves back on. "Then let's get started." She followed Greer every step of the day. She didn't hover, she wasn't stupid enough to look desperate, but she stayed close enough to hear every note he made and see every measurement he took. When he wrote something down, she watched his pencil. When he paused at something, she made herself notice what he was looking at. He paused at the east pasture trough. Eleanor's stomach tightened. But Nathan had fixed it 2 days ago properly. Fixed it, not just stopped the leak, but replaced the cracked section of pipe that had been causing it. The ground around it was still soft, but it was drying. There was nothing to photograph that looked worse than a wet winter field. Greer made a note. Eleanor couldn't read it from where she stood. He paused at the barn wall. Eleanor had patched it with new lumber, which was actually more solid than the original construction. Greer measured the dimensions of the repair and wrote something down. He paused at the south fence, the one she and Nathan had fixed together, working in the cold with 2 sets of hands until the wire was taut and the posts were solid. Greer walked the line for 20 feet in each direction, checking each post with his hand. "Recent work," he said, not to Eleanor, just noting it out loud. "I keep my fences up," Eleanor said. He looked at her. Then he looked at his notes. Then he kept walking. At 3 in the afternoon, Greer packed up his satchel. He stood in the center of the yard and made his final notes and said without inflection, "You'll receive the written assessment within the week." "What's your number?" Eleanor said. "The formal report." "I'm asking what you saw today. Give me a ballpark." Greer looked at her. For the first time that day, something shifted in his professional blankness. Not sympathy, exactly. Something closer to reluctant respect. "The property is distressed," he said carefully, "but less distressed than the preliminary information suggested. The recent repairs are visible and will be noted." He paused. "That's all I can tell you." He walked back to his buggy. Eleanor looked at Pruitt, still at the fence line where she'd made him stay. He was watching her with a flat measuring expression. He didn't say anything, neither did she. She went inside and sat down at the kitchen table, and her hands were shaking, not from cold this time, and she pressed them flat against the wood and breathed until they stopped. She didn't know if it was enough. She had done everything she could do. She had worked herself past what she'd thought her limit was, and Nathan had shown up on that road at exactly the moment she'd needed him to, and they had gotten it done. And she still didn't know if it was enough. She was at the water pump the next morning when she heard hooves on the road and looked up and saw Nathan coming the same easy, unhurried way he always moved on horseback. He pulled up at the fence line and looked at her. "Appraiser came yesterday," she said before he could ask. I know. I saw the buggy on my way into town. He paused. Pruitt was with him. Pruitt waited at the fence. Something moved across Nathan's face. Not quite a smile. You made him wait at the fence. My property, my terms. Yes, he said. They are. He got down from his horse and came through the gate, and Eleanor realized she'd gotten used to this the way he always asked the fence for permission instead of just assuming. The way he didn't walk into her yard like he'd already decided he belonged there. How did it go? He said. Greer said the repairs were visible. That's all he'd give me. She set the pump handle. I won't know until the report. And then you have 30 days. If the number's too low, to counter with my own appraiser. She looked at him. Which costs money I don't have. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Not an uncomfortable quiet. She'd learned that about him in the past week. He didn't fill silences with noise. He sat in them until he had something worth saying. I know a man in Pueblo, he said. Retired assessor. He does appraisals for cost not profit, honest reports. He paused. If you need him. Eleanor looked at him carefully. Why do you know a retired assessor in Pueblo? Nathan met her eyes. Because I've needed honest paperwork myself. It was the most personal thing he'd said to her in the week she'd known him. She didn't push at it. She understood the instinct to offer the useful part without offering the whole story. I'll keep that in mind, she said. He nodded. I should get to town. Nathan. She said his name and then wasn't sure what she'd meant to say after it. He waited. She looked at the gate they'd rehung together at the fence line he'd helped her hold. Thank you for last week. You did most of it, he said. Don't do that. He looked at her. Don't make it smaller than it was, she said. I needed help and you helped me. That's what it was. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. You're welcome. He got on his horse and rode toward town. Eleanor watched him go and felt for the third or fourth time, now that specific feeling she still didn't have the right word, for the feeling of a door she hadn't decided about yet. The report came on Friday. It came in an envelope delivered by the bank's errand boy, a teenager named Colt, who'd been doing that job for 2 years and had the particular expression of someone who had learned to be invisible when delivering bad news. He handed Eleanor the envelope and got back on his horse before she'd opened it. She opened it at the kitchen table. She read the number twice. Then she read the page of methodology that arrived at the number looking for the line items that moved the value, the way a prosecutor reads a charging document looking for what she could fight. The total assessed value was lower than she'd hoped. Higher than Pruitt had probably wanted. In the middle ground, that was the most dangerous place to be, because it meant the bank could call the note if they chose to, and they could also choose not to, which meant the decision now had a political dimension that pure math didn't have. She found the line that concerned her most. The East Pasture Trough noted as recently repaired evidence of prior water damage to surrounding soil, long-term stability uncertain. The barn wall, repaired structural integrity, appears sound, recommend monitoring. The north fence, adequate. The south fence, recently reinforced, satisfactory. Greer had been fair, she thought. He'd reported what he'd seen. The recently repaired condition of everything was both the best she could have hoped for and the thing most likely to be used against her, because it showed the property had been in worse condition recently, which Pruitt could argue suggested a pattern. She needed to talk to someone who knew land law. She didn't know any lawyers. She knew she couldn't afford a lawyer. She sat with the report for an hour and then got up and drove into Clearwater. Agnes Colton ran the dry goods store with her husband Henry, who was largely invisible in the business, the way husbands sometimes were when their wives were the ones actually running things. Agnes was sharp and practical and had opinions about everything, and Eleanor had never particularly liked her, but she trusted her information. Agnes knew everyone and everything in Clearwater with the comprehensive accuracy of a woman who had been listening carefully for 30 years. I need to know if there's anyone in this town who knows property law. Eleanor said, setting her purchases on the counter. Agnes didn't look surprised. Nothing surprised Agnes. What kind of property law? Bank loans, early call clauses, appraisal disputes. Agnes began counting out the change. Fred Marsh handled land disputes before he retired. He's not a practicing attorney anymore, but he still knows the statutes. She set the coins on the counter. You'd have to ask him nicely. Fred doesn't do favors for people he doesn't like. Does Fred like me? Agnes looked at her with the frank assessment of a woman who had known Eleanor Graves for 30 years and had opinions about her that went in both directions. Fred respects people who fight for their land, she said. He'll like you well enough. Eleanor picked up her change. And Pruitt? What's Pruitt's angle with the bank? Do you know anything specific? Agnes was quiet for just a moment. A careful quiet. I heard from Mavis Danvers Bill's wife that Gerald made a donation to the building fund for the new bank branch. Substantial one. Eleanor felt something cold move through her that wasn't the weather. When? 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago. Before the appraisal was requested. Before Eleanor had found the clause. Agnes, Eleanor said carefully. Is Mavis Danvers the kind of woman who repeats things she shouldn't? Only to people she trusts. Agnes met her eyes. And only when she thinks someone ought to know. Eleanor picked up her package. Thank you. Eleanor. Agnes's voice stopped her at the door. Eleanor turned. Agnes was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from the woman before, not the satisfied certainty of someone whose predictions had proven correct, but something closer to genuine concern. Nathan Hale. The man at the Kavanaugh place. Eleanor went still. What about him? He's a good man. I don't say that easily. Agnes went back to her counting. That's all. Eleanor stood at the door for a moment. Then she left. Fred Marsh lived in a small house on the eastern edge of Clearwater, with his dog and his books, and the contained dignity of a man who had stopped needing other people's approval sometime in his 60s. He answered the door at Eleanor's knock, looked at her for a moment, and said, Come in then. I've been expecting someone would bring me this problem eventually. She hadn't told him why she was coming. She raised an eyebrow. Gerald Pruitt's been buying drinks at the saloon and talking about the Graves property, Fred said, leading her to his study. A man who talks that much about a thing he doesn't own yet is usually worried it's going to slip away from him. Sit down. She sat. She put the bank report on the desk between them. Fred read it the way lawyers read things, not quickly, not slowly, but with a particular density of attention that meant he was reading every word, and also the spaces between the words. He turned the pages without hurry. Eleanor waited. The early call clause, he said finally. I know. The assessment came in above the trigger threshold. He tapped the number. Barely, but above. Can they still call it? The clause says 20% decline. This assessment shows 18.5. Fred looked at her over his glasses. If the bank acts in good faith, no. They cannot call it. And if they don't act in good faith... Fred set the report down. Then they call it anyway and hope you can't afford to fight. Which is usually a safe bet. What would fighting look like? Counter-appraisal, as you probably know, then a formal objection to the call filed within 30 days. It goes to a district judge if the bank doesn't back down, and district judges in this part of Colorado do not like it when banks play games with widows' land. He paused. Particularly if you can show the bank received material benefit from a competing bidder prior to requesting the assessment. Eleanor looked at him. The donation. Fred's eyebrows went up. What donation? Gerald Pruitt made a substantial donation to the bank's building fund 6 weeks ago, before the appraisal was requested. Fred was quiet for a very long moment. Can you prove that? I have a source. Whether the source will testify is another question. Get the proof, Fred said. If you can document that Pruitt paid money to the bank before requesting an assessment of your property, you don't just have a defense. You have a cause of action." He leaned forward. "That's not just Gerald Pruitt trying to buy your land, Mrs. Graves. That's potential bank fraud." The word sat between them like something with weight. Eleanor breathed. "What do I need to do?" "First, hire your own appraiser. Get a counter-assessment on the books within the 30-day window. That protects you from the immediate call even if it comes. Second, find out what Pruitt paid when and to whom. Third—" Fred paused. "Do you trust anyone at that bank?" "I trusted Bill Danvers for 16 years, Eleanor said. "I'm not sure what I trust now. His wife, perhaps." Eleanor thought about Agnes Colton's careful voice. "Only to people she trusts." "Perhaps," she said. Chapter key. She drove home in the late afternoon with the particular clarity that comes from having a plan, not certainty, not safety, but direction. The arithmetic had changed shape. It was still difficult, but difficulty she could work with. Difficulty had always been something she could work with. Nathan's horse was tied at her fence when she got back. He was in the yard repairing something on the corral. She hadn't even asked him to look at a section of the top rail that had been cracked since September and that she'd been meaning to get to. He'd already replaced the damaged section with new lumber she recognized as coming from his own property, not hers. She stopped the wagon. She got down. She stood at the edge of the yard and looked at what he was doing and felt something that was not quite anger, and not quite gratitude, and not quite either of those things. "I didn't ask you to do that," she said. "Nathan kept working." "No." "Nathan." He stopped. He turned and looked at her. "Why are you here?" He held her gaze. "Because the rail was cracked and the cattle could push through it, and I had the lumber." "That's not what I'm asking." He set down his tools. He looked at her with the straight, undefended attention she'd been getting used to the way he looked at things when he decided to stop hedging. "Because I want to," he said. "Not because I want something from you. Not because I'm keeping score. Because I pull into that road every morning, and I think about what you're carrying alone out here, and I have two hands that aren't otherwise occupied, and that seems like a simple equation to me." Eleanor stood very still. "It doesn't feel simple to me," she said. "I know," he said. "I know it doesn't." She looked at the repaired section of rail. She looked at her hands. She looked at Nathan Hale, standing in her yard, with sawdust on his coat, and no angle in his eyes that she could find, and she thought about James and the paperwork, and the 2 years of arithmetic that had been hers alone. "I went to see Fred Marsh today," she said. Something in his expression shifted careful attention. "Pruitt paid money to the bank before the appraisal. If I can prove it, Marsh thinks I have a fraud case." Nathan said nothing for a moment. Then, "What do you need?" There it was again. That question. Not, "I'll handle it." Not, "Let me take care of it." Not, "What are you going to do about it?" What do you need? Eleanor felt something in her chest. Do something she didn't have a clean word for. Not opening exactly. Not breaking. Something in between. "I need a counter-appraiser," she said. "You mentioned a man in Pueblo. I can reach him. I need proof of the donation. I might have a path to that through someone in town, but I need to ask carefully." "All right. And I need—" She stopped. This was the hard one. This was the thing she'd been not saying for a week, the thing that sat at the back of her throat every time he rode away. "I need to know that when this is over, whether I win or lose, nothing about how you've helped me changes what this land is. It's mine. It stays mine. Whatever happens between us or doesn't happen. You understand that?" Nathan looked at her for a long moment. His expression was the most readable it had ever been, which somehow made it harder to look at. "Eleanor," he said the first time he'd used her name, "I have not once thought about your land." The way he said it, quiet and level, and completely without performance. She believed him. That was the thing that shook her. After 2 years of making herself not believe men, she looked at Nathan Hale standing in her yard with sawdust on his coat and a repaired fence rail behind him, and she believed him. She wasn't sure what to do with that either. "Finish the rail," she said. "Then come inside. I'll make coffee and we'll figure out the next steps." He picked up his tools. Eleanor went inside. She put the kettle on. She got the cups from the shelf. She laid the bank report and Fred Marsh's notes on the table and looked at them and thought about fraud cases and counter-appraisals and 30-day windows. And she thought about a man who, when she'd told him exactly where her line was, had said, "I have not once thought about your land," and meant it. The kettle began to heat. Outside, she could hear the clean sound of new lumber being fitted into place. She had 6 days behind her and an unknown number ahead. The arithmetic was still hard. The risk was still real. Gerald Pruitt was still out there, patient and certain and funded in ways she wasn't. But for the first time since she'd opened that envelope on Friday morning, Eleanor Graves sat down at her own kitchen table and did not feel entirely alone. The coffee between them went cold before either of them touched it. That was how it went that first evening at Eleanor's kitchen table. The two of them bent over the bank report and Fred Marsh's notes, and a map of the property that Eleanor had pulled from the drawer where she kept the documents that mattered, and the coffee sitting forgotten, because neither of them was thinking about coffee. Nathan had a way of looking at problems that Eleanor hadn't encountered before. He didn't rush to solutions. He read carefully, asked precise questions, and waited for the full answer before asking the next one. He didn't perform confidence the way men often did when they wanted to appear useful. He just thought visibly and without embarrassment, and said what he thought when he'd finished thinking it. "The donation is the key," he said. "Marsh is right. If Pruitt paid the bank before the appraisal was requested, and you can prove the timing, that's not just leverage, that's evidence. Mavis Danvers knows something. Agnes said so." Eleanor wrapped her hands around the cold cup without drinking from it. "But I can't walk up to Bill Danvers' wife and ask her to testify against her husband's bank." "No," Nathan said. "But you can let her decide whether to." He paused. "There's a difference between asking someone to do something and making it possible for them to choose." Eleanor looked at him. "That's a careful distinction." Most important distinctions are. She thought about Mavis Danvers. She'd known Mavis for years, not well, but enough. Mavis was a quiet woman who had spent decades standing slightly behind her husband at church socials and town meetings. Eleanor had always assumed the quietness was contentment. Now she wondered if she'd been wrong. "I'll go see her tomorrow," Eleanor said. "Alone," Nathan said. Not a question. "Alone," Eleanor confirmed. Two women talking over coffee is one thing. If you come, it becomes something else. He nodded without argument. She noticed that about him, the way he accepted the logic of things, without needing to renegotiate every decision. It was a small thing. It felt enormous. "The counter-appraiser," she said. "Your man in Pueblo. Robert Sykes. I'll send a wire tomorrow morning." "How much does he charge?" Nathan was quiet for just a beat. "Let me handle that." Eleanor's spine went straight. "No." "Eleanor, no." Her voice was quiet, but there was nothing soft in it. "I told you what this land is. That means what's spent to protect it comes from me, not from you." She met his eyes. "Tell me what he charges." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. $40 for the assessment and the report. She had $70 left. $40 would leave her $30. $30 was not enough to get through February, let alone spring. "All right," she said. "Eleanor, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She stood up and took the cold coffee cups to the wash basin. "That's why I'm choosing to." He was quiet behind her. She heard him fold the papers carefully, the way he handled everything without fuss, without ceremony, but with attention. "I'll send the wire first thing," he said. "Sykes can probably be here within the week." "Good." She turned back to the table. "Go home, Nathan. You've got your own ranch to run." He stood. He picked up his hat. He looked at her with that expression she was starting to understand, the one that wasn't quite a smile, but occupied the same space. "Same time tomorrow," he said. She felt the corner of her mouth move against her will. "I didn't invite you." "No," he said. "You didn't." He let himself out. Eleanor listened to his horse pull away and stood in the quiet of her kitchen and felt for the second time in one evening the strange, disorienting feeling of not being entirely alone. She wasn't sure yet if it was something to lean into or something to be afraid of. She suspected it was probably both. Mavis Danvers answered her door the next morning with the expression of a woman who had been expecting something and wasn't sure whether it was this. "Eleanor," she said. "Mavis, I was hoping we could talk." Mavis looked past Eleanor's shoulder, checking Eleanor realized whether anyone had seen her come to the door. Then she stepped back and let Eleanor in. The Danvers house was warm and precisely ordered, in the way of a woman with too much time and not enough to do with it. Mavis led her to the kitchen, not the parlor Eleanor noted, where a conversation could be formal. The kitchen where things were real and put the kettle on without asking. They talked about nothing for the first few minutes. Weather, the price of flour. Mavis's daughter in Denver, who had just had her second child. Eleanor let it breathe, let the nothing talk do its work, because she understood that you didn't come straight at things like this. Then Mavis set a cup in front of her and sat down across the table and said very quietly, "Bill doesn't know I talked to Agnes." "I know. I shouldn't have." Mavis wrapped both hands around her cup. "But I kept thinking if it was my land, if someone was doing to my land what Gerald Pruitt is doing to yours." She looked up. "It's not right, Eleanor. Whatever you did or didn't do with the offers, what he's doing is not right." "I know that too." Eleanor kept her voice steady. "Mavis, I need to understand what happened. Specifically, the donation, when did it happen, and what exactly was said?" Mavis was quiet. The kettle was still hot on the stove. The kitchen felt very small. "Gerald came to the house," she said finally. "Not the bank. The house. 6 weeks ago, maybe 7. Bill didn't tell me. I heard them talking in the study. Gerald said he wanted to make a contribution to the expansion fund, and Bill said it was very generous, and then Gerald said—" She stopped. "What did he say?" Mavis looked at her cup. "He said he'd be grateful if the bank would look at the Graves property situation carefully. That he thought the note was at risk, and it would be a shame if the bank took a loss when a qualified buyer was available." She paused. "Bill said he couldn't make promises. Gerald said he understood completely. And then the contribution was $200. $200 to a small-town bank expansion fund from a man who'd been trying to buy Eleanor's land for a year." Eleanor breathed. "Did Bill know you heard no?" "Mavis." Eleanor chose her words with the same care she gave to mending wire fence, because the wrong pressure in the wrong place broke things. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I want you to understand that. Whatever you decide, I'm not going to hold it against you either way." Mavis looked at her. "But if this goes to a judge," Eleanor continued, "and there's evidence of what happened, the timing, the amount, what was said, it doesn't just protect my land. It means no one else in this county gets handled the same way by Gerald Pruitt." She paused. "That's the full picture. You can decide what to do with it." Mavis was quiet for a long moment. She turned her cup in a slow circle on the table around and around the way a person moves when they're thinking hard enough that their hands need something to do. "I need to think," she said. "Of course. Give me a few days." "You have more time than that." Eleanor stood. "The 30-day window runs until the 3rd week of December. We're not at the crisis point yet." Mavis walked her to the door. At the threshold she said, "Eleanor," and Eleanor turned. "You're not doing this alone, are you? I heard Nathan Hale has been out at your place." Eleanor kept her face even. "He's been neighborly." Mavis looked at her with the particular perception of a woman who had been watching other people's marriages for 30 years. "He's a good man," she said. "He was decent to a lot of people when he came through here, and decent people are not as common as they should be." "No," Eleanor said. "They're not." She drove home thinking about $200 and a conversation in a study and a woman who had been quiet for too long, deciding whether to stop. Tag. The wire back from Robert Sykes arrived 2 days later. He could come the following Tuesday. Nathan brought the message to her door, with the particular straightforwardness she'd come to expect, no preamble, no performance, just the information she needed delivered the moment he had it. Tuesday, she said, reading the wire. That's 12 days before the window closes. Enough time, Nathan said. If his assessment is favorable. It'll be honest, Nathan said. Honest is what you need. She looked at him. He was standing at the edge of the porch, not presuming to come in without being asked, as he still did every time. She had stopped noticing it consciously, and started noticing when it wasn't there, which was never. Come in, she said. I need to show you something. She'd been working on a document all morning, a written timeline of every interaction with Pruitt, every offer, every refusal, every visit with dates where she had them, and approximations where she didn't. Beside it, she'd laid out the bank clause, Greer's assessment, and Fred Marsh's notes. Nathan sat across the table from her and read everything she'd laid out with that same dense, quiet attention. When he finished, he looked up. This is good work, he said. I should have done it a year ago, Eleanor said. I should have been writing everything down from the beginning. You were surviving. I was surviving and not paying attention to the paperwork, which is how I ended up here. You're paying attention now. She looked at the table covered in documents and felt the familiar mixture of competence and rage. Competence, because she'd built this assembled, it understood it. Rage, because she'd had to. Because none of this should have been necessary. Because a woman who paid her debts and kept her fences up and refused to sell land she'd bled for should not have had to become her own legal department to keep what was hers. I used to think James kept me from the paperwork because he was protecting me, she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way things did when you'd been alone long enough without the usual gates. I understand now that he kept me from it because the paperwork was the power. Whoever holds the documents holds the land. Nathan didn't say anything. I will never, Eleanor said, not read a document again. Not for the rest of my life. No, Nathan said quietly. I don't imagine you will. Something about the way he said it, without pity, without the softening people applied when they thought you needed to be managed, made her throat do that thing it kept doing around him. You were going to tell me, she said, about why you know Robert Sykes, about the honest paperwork you needed yourself. Nathan looked at the table. That wasn't an invitation. I know, I'm extending one. He was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to decline. He had a right to. She hadn't told him everything either. Then he said, I had a partner once. Business partner. We ran cattle together for 6 years in Wyoming. Built something worth having. He paused. When we split the operation, the division wasn't honest. I didn't read the dissolution agreement carefully enough. I was in a hurry to be done with it. A pause. I ended up with less than half of what I'd put in and no legal standing to contest it because I'd signed the papers. Eleanor looked at him. That's why you came to Colorado. That's why I started over. And Sykes. He assessed the Wyoming property during the dispute. He was the only person in the whole proceeding who told me exactly what the numbers were. He didn't fix it. But he told me the truth about it. Nathan met her eyes. I've trusted his numbers since. Eleanor absorbed that. A man who'd been taken by paperwork just as she had, not by a husband, but by a partner. Not by intimacy, but by trust misplaced in a business arrangement. The same lesson learned through different pain. We are remarkably similar, she said, for two people who have spent the past month pretending we're not. Something shifted in Nathan's face, something that was definitely closer to a smile than anything she'd seen before. Yes, he said. We are. And Robert Sykes arrived on Tuesday as promised in a plain wagon with a battered case of instruments and the manner of a man who had been appraising properties for 40 years and had long since stopped being impressed by either grandeur or disaster. He was in his late 60s, compact with the economical movements of someone who had learned not to waste anything, including time. He shook Eleanor's hand with the grip of someone who had decided in the first 2 seconds that she was worth a firm handshake. "You the one fighting Pruitt," he said. "I'm the one protecting my land," Eleanor said. "If that puts me in Pruitt's way, that's his problem." Sykes looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. "Let's see what you've got." Nathan had come at Eleanor's request, not as help, but as a witness. She wanted someone she trusted to hear every number Sykes put forward, to ask questions she might not think to ask. Nathan understood this and stayed exactly where she needed him present, paying attention, not in front of her. Sykes spent 4 hours on the property. He was more thorough than Greer had been and more communicative. He narrated as he worked, explaining what he was measuring and why what the numbers meant, what a judge would look at. By the end of the second hour, Eleanor had stopped feeling like a subject being examined and started feeling like someone being taught. At 4 in the afternoon, Sykes sat at her kitchen table and spread his notes in front of him and said, "The Greer assessment was low." Eleanor went still. "Not dramatically low," Sykes said, "but the comparable properties he used to establish baseline value were selectively chosen. He used 3 sales from the past 18 months. I would use 5, and 2 of his 3 are outliers, both distressed sales, not representative of functional ranch land in this corridor." He tapped his notes. "My number is $900 higher than Greer's." $900. At a property value of roughly $11,000, that was the difference between an 18.5% decline and a 16% decline. Below the 20% trigger. Clearly below it. Eleanor pressed her hands flat on the table. "That's enough. That's enough," Sykes said. "If the bank tries to call this note based on Greer's assessment, you file this counter-report, and the call fails on the numbers. A judge takes one look at this and dismisses it." He looked at her. "But that only covers the appraisal question." "There's also the donation," Nathan said. Sykes looked at him, then at Eleanor. "What donation?" Eleanor told him. "All of it. Mavis Danvers, the conversation through the study wall, the $200, the timing." Sykes listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "If you can document that," he said slowly, "you don't just defeat the appraisal call. You have grounds for a complaint to the Territorial Banking Commission. What Pruitt did paying money to a bank before requesting action favorable to himself on a specific property, that's called influencing a fiduciary. It's not just unethical, it's actionable." "Can a woman file that complaint?" Eleanor asked. Sykes looked at her. "A property owner can file that complaint. You own this land." "I do. Then you can file it." The kitchen was very quiet. Eleanor heard the wind outside, the familiar sound of her ranch in early December, the sound she'd been listening to for 2 years alone. "What does it cost to file?" she said. "It costs a letter and a trip to the county seat." Sykes met her eyes. "The commission does the investigating." Eleanor looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at her. Neither of them said anything out loud, but something moved between them. Recognition, maybe, or the particular alignment of 2 people who have separately spent years learning the same hard lessons and have just now found themselves on the same side of the same table. "Write me the report," Eleanor said to Sykes. "Everything you told me formal and signed. I'll have it to you by Friday." It was Thursday evening when Mavis Danvers came to Eleanor's door. Eleanor didn't expect her. She heard the knock and opened it and found Mavis standing on the porch in her good coat, holding a folded piece of paper in both hands with the particular grip of someone who has made a decision and is not going to unmake it. "Come in," Eleanor said. Mavis came in. She looked around the kitchen at the documents on the table, the lamp burning the single cup that meant Eleanor had been working alone. Something moved across her face. "I wrote it down," Mavis said. She put the folded paper on the table. "Everything I heard. The date as close as I can remember it. What Gerald said. What Bill said. The amount." She looked at Eleanor. "I signed it." Eleanor looked at the paper. She looked at Mavis. "You understand what this means?" Eleanor said carefully. "For Bill." "Bill didn't take the money," Mavis said. "He accepted a donation to a building fund." What Gerald said afterward, Bill should have said no to that. He should have walked Gerald out of our house and written the check back. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. "He didn't. That's on him. But I am not going to sit in my kitchen and watch Gerald Pruitt steal a woman's land because my husband didn't have the backbone to say no to $200. Eleanor picked up the paper. She unfolded it and read it every word, every detail, and when she looked up, her eyes were doing something she hadn't given them permission to do. "Mavis," she said. "Don't," Mavis said. "Just use it." Eleanor folded the paper carefully and placed it with Sykes's working notes. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it." Mavis looked at the table covered in documents. "Will it be enough?" "I don't know yet," Eleanor said honestly, "but it's a great deal more than I had a week ago." After Mavis left, Eleanor sat at the table for a long time. The lamp burned low, and she let it sitting in the dimming light with the documents around her and the paper Mavis had signed sitting on top of everything else, like a declaration. Two women who had spent years being quiet about things that mattered. One of them deciding to stop. She heard hooves on the road. She knew the sound of his horse by now, the particular rhythm of it, the pace Nathan kept even in the dark. She heard him stop at the fence. She heard him not come through because she hadn't asked him to. She got up and opened the door. "I saw Mavis Danvers leave," he said from the fence line. She signed a statement. He was quiet. She could see him in the dark, just his shape, the outline of him, the stillness he carried. "Nathan," she said. "Come in." He came through the gate. He came up to the porch. He stood 2 steps below her, so their eyes were level, and she looked at him, this man who had showed up without an angle, who had fixed her fence rail without being asked and called in a favor from a man in Pueblo, and spent a month helping her fight a battle that had nothing to do with him, except that he had chosen to be on her side. "I need to ask you something," she said. "All right. When this is over, when the appraisal is filed and the complaint is made and Pruitt has been dealt with one way or another, what do you want?" She held his gaze. "Not what you've been careful to not ask for, what you actually want." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that wasn't evasion, but thought. "I want to keep riding past your fence on my way to town," he said. "And I want you to keep opening the door." He paused. "That's all. That's the full extent of my ambition." Eleanor looked at him. "That's a modest want for a man who spent a month repairing my property," she said. "I'm a modest man." She felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Something that wasn't relief and wasn't safety, but was adjacent to both of them. Something lighter than what she'd been carrying. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make fresh coffee and tell you what Mavis told me, and we'll figure out what happens next." He came up the steps. He came through her door. He sat at the table across from her the way he always did, not at the head of it, not taking up more space than he occupied, just across from her, even and present and entirely without agenda. Eleanor poured the coffee. She set both cups on the table. She sat down. Outside, the wind moved through the eaves the way it always did on winter nights, the sound she'd been listening to alone for 2 years. But the kitchen was warm. The lamp was bright. And for the first time since James had died, and the paperwork had come, and the world had rearranged itself around her, the silence in the room felt inhabited rather than empty. She had Sykes's report coming Friday. She had Mavis's statement in hand. She had Fred Marsh's legal framework, and a 30-day window that still had 12 days in it, and a banking commission that did not reportedly like fraud. Gerald Pruitt didn't know yet what was coming for him. Eleanor picked up her coffee cup and looked at the man across the table and thought good. Sykes's report arrived Friday morning, exactly as promised. Eleanor read it at the kitchen table, before she'd done anything else before coffee, before checking on the cattle, before the list of tasks that began every day of her life. She read it the way she read everything now, completely carefully looking for the spaces between the words as much as the words themselves. It was clean. It was thorough. It was the kind of document that had been written by someone who understood that the truth was the most aggressive weapon available and had deployed it accordingly. Every number was sourced. Every comparable sale was documented. Every methodological choice was explained in language that a judge could follow without a legal education. At the bottom, Robert Sykes had written in his cramped, careful hand, "Property value, as assessed, reflects a working ranch in active recovery. Evidence of recent maintenance and repair consistent with engaged ownership. Recommend no basis for early note call under existing loan terms." Engaged ownership. Eleanor read those two words twice. She put the report down and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she got up and made the coffee and fed the cattle and started her day. Because the report being good didn't stop the fence from needing checking or the water troughs from needing breaking open in the cold. Nathan came by mid-morning. She showed him the report without preamble, set it on the fence post between them, and let him read it. He read it completely the way he always did. "This is enough," he said, "combined with Mavis's statement." "Combined with Mavis's statement," he agreed. He handed the report back. "When are you going to Fred Marsh?" "This afternoon. He'll know how to file the complaint and whether we do it before or after the note call." She tucked the report inside her coat. "Pruitt doesn't know about Sykes. He doesn't know about Mavis." "No. Good." She looked at him. "I want to file everything at once, the counter-assessment and the fraud complaint. Same day, same moment, so he can't react to one before the other lands." Nathan looked at her with that expression, the one she'd stopped pretending she didn't recognize. "You've been planning this." "I've been thinking," she said. "There's a difference." "Not in this case," he said, and she felt the corner of her mouth move. Fred Marsh read Sykes's report with the same density of attention he'd given everything else. And when he finished, he set it down and folded his hands on the desk and said, "This is good. This is very good. I also have a signed statement from a witness to the donation," Eleanor said. She placed Mavis's folded paper on the desk. Fred picked it up. He read it. He set it down carefully, the way you set down something fragile that you don't want to break. "Mavis Danvers," he said. "Yes, she understands what she signed. She signed it knowing exactly what it means." Fred was quiet for a moment. He looked at the two documents side by side, Sykes's formal assessment and Mavis's handwritten statement, and something moved across his face that Eleanor thought might be the professional equivalent of satisfaction. "Here is what I recommend," he said. "You file the counter-assessment with the bank today. Formal delivery with a signed receipt. That stops the appraisal dispute clock and protects you from the immediate call." He paused. "Then 3 days from now, you file the complaint with the Territorial Banking Commission. The 3-day gap gives the bank time to receive Sykes's report and understand what they're facing, but not enough time to warn Pruitt before the commission gets the complaint." Eleanor thought about that. "Why does the gap matter?" "Because when the commission contacts the bank's first instinct will be to protect itself. And the way a bank protects itself from a fraud complaint is by cooperating with the investigation." Fred looked at her. "You want Bill Danvers frightened and cooperative before Pruitt has a chance to get to him." It was elegant. Eleanor had not expected Fred Marsh, retired and domestic and faintly dusty, to be elegant. "You've done this before," she said. "I did land law for 35 years, Fred said. "Gerald Pruitt is not the first man who thought that money and patience were enough to take what he wanted." He picked up a pen. "Let's write the cover letter for the assessment." They worked for 2 hours. Fred wrote and Eleanor corrected, and they argued twice, once about tone, once about which statute to cite. And both times, Eleanor was right, and Fred acknowledged it without drama, which raised him considerably in her estimation. When she left his house, she had 2 documents ready to file. The counter-assessment for the bank, signed and sealed. The fraud complaint for the Banking Commission, signed and dated, waiting for Tuesday. She drove home with them on the seat beside her, and thought about the fact that 3 weeks ago she'd been standing in the east pasture telling herself the math wouldn't work. She filed the counter-assessment with the bank Saturday morning. She handed it personally to the teller, not to Bill Danvers, who was in his office and visible through the glass partition, and who looked up and saw her, and went very still and asked for a signed receipt, which she got. The teller was a young woman named Clara, who had no idea what she was processing, and signed the receipt with the cheerful efficiency of someone handling routine paperwork. Eleanor thanked her, folded the receipt into her coat, and walked out without looking at Danvers. In the street, she stood for a moment. The cold was sharp. Clear water moved around her the way it always did on Saturday mornings, people on errands, horses at the rail, the ordinary business of a small town living its ordinary life. She thought about Gerald Pruitt somewhere in this town or his ranch, or wherever he spent his Saturdays, not knowing yet that his timeline had just been dismantled. She went to the post office to check her mail. Roy Lester was there coming out as she went in, and he stopped and looked at her with an expression that mixed concern and curiosity in roughly equal parts. "Eleanor, you all right? You look like a woman who's just done something." "I'm always doing something, Roy. You know Pruitt's been in town this week." He said it the way people said things they thought were warnings. "He was at the bank twice." "Good for him." Roy frowned. "Eleanor, I'm trying to—" "I know you are." She softened slightly because Roy was not a bad man and his worry was genuine. "I'm all right. I know what I'm doing." He didn't look entirely convinced, but he let her go. Inside the post office there was a single letter for her. No return address. The handwriting on the envelope was careful and anonymous, the kind of handwriting that had been deliberately made nondescript. She opened it in the post office doorway. It was 4 lines. No salutation, no signature. "Careful how far you push. Men who lose money in public tend to make private problems for the people who cost them. The Kavanaugh property is 6 miles from yours and borders your north pasture. Accidents happen in that country in winter." Eleanor read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket with the counter-assessment receipt. Her hands were completely steady. She drove the 6 miles to Nathan's ranch without stopping. The Kavanaugh place. Nathan's place now was a modest spread smaller than hers, but she could see in 20 seconds of looking at it that he had been working it hard since August. The fences were tight. The outbuildings were in repair. There was wood stacked properly under the eave of the barn, enough for a long winter stacked the way someone stacked wood when they intended to be there for it. Nathan came out of the barn when he heard the wagon. He looked at her face and didn't say anything, just waited. She got down and gave him the letter. He read it. He read it again. The muscle in his jaw moved once. "When did this come?" he said. "This morning. Post office." He looked at it a third time the way you looked at something you wanted to understand completely. Then he looked up. "He's threatening both of us." "He's threatening you to get to me," Eleanor said. "There's a difference. My land is what he wants. You're the pressure point." Nathan's expression was very controlled. She'd learned to read the control as the thing underneath it. Not coldness, but the active management of something that ran hot. "Are you frightened?" he said. "Yes," she said, because she was, and she'd decided some time ago to stop lying to herself about the things that frightened her. "But I'm not stopping. Neither am I." "Nathan." She looked at him directly. "This is my fight. If you want to step back from it, I understand that. You didn't come to Colorado to get sideways with a man like Pruitt." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face. Not offense exactly, but the thing that came just before it, the moment when someone decides whether to be hurt or just clear. "Eleanor," he said, "when have I given you any indication that I walk away from things?" She had no answer for that, because he hadn't, not once. She put the letter back in her pocket. "We file the complaint Tuesday. Fred Marsh says we do it 3 days after the counter-assessment hits the bank." 3 days, Nathan said. "All right. In the meantime," She looked at his property, at the fences, at the work he'd done. Be careful. Keep your eyes open. If anything happens on this property, anything at all, you tell me immediately. Yes, he said. Same for you. She started to get back on the wagon. He put a hand on the side of the wagon, not stopping her just there. Come to supper tonight, he said. You shouldn't be alone out there right now. She looked at his hand on the wagon. She looked at him. I've been alone out there for 2 years, she said. I know. Come anyway. She went. Not because she was afraid, or not only because she was afraid, but because the offer was made without strings, and she was learning slowly that accepting a thing without strings wasn't the same as owing something. Supper at Nathan's kitchen table was the most ordinary 2 hours Eleanor had spent in months, and somehow that was the part that undid her. He cooked without fuss beans and salt pork and cornbread, the food of a man who fed himself practically and well. He set the table with the same attention he gave everything not ceremonial, just correct. They ate and talked about the ranch, about cattle prices, about the spring thaw, and what it would do to the road between their properties. Ordinary things. The kind of things that people talked about when they were simply in each other's company, without an agenda. Halfway through supper, Eleanor realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a meal that someone else had made for her. She put her fork down. Nathan looked up. What? Nothing. She picked the fork back up. This is good. He looked at her, the real look, the one that didn't accept deflection. Eleanor. She set the fork down again. She looked at the table. I forgot what this was like, she said. Eating with someone. Just being somewhere that someone else also is. She looked up at him. I forgot that it felt different. I'd convinced myself it didn't. Nathan was quiet. He didn't try to make it smaller or larger than it was. How long has it actually been? He said. Not since James died. How long has it been since you were actually not alone? She thought about that honestly. Longer than 2 years, she said. Longer than that. He nodded. Not with pity. She couldn't have stood pity right now. With recognition. The nod of someone who understood exactly what it meant to locate the real beginning of a loneliness and find it further back than you'd admitted. Wyoming, she said. Wyoming. He agreed. They finished supper. She helped him clear the table, and they did it with the naturalness of people who had arrived without planning to, at a comfortable rhythm. She knew where he kept things from. The one time she'd seen him reach for the dishcloth, and she went to the right place without thinking, and he noticed that she noticed, and something in his expression went quiet and warm. She didn't stay late. She drove home in the cold dark, and the letter in her coat pocket rustled every time she moved, reminding her of what was still out there of Gerald Pruitt's patience and his money and his willingness to threaten a man's winter property to get what he wanted. But the supper stayed with her too. The beans and cornbread, the ordinary conversation, the way two people could sit across a table and simply be somewhere together. She thought that is also a thing worth fighting for. Monday came in hard. Eleanor was in the barn when she heard the horse coming fast, faster than people normally came to her place, the kind of speed that meant something was wrong. She came out and saw it was Colt, the bank's errand boy, and his face had the particular look of someone who had been told to hurry and hadn't been told why. He handed her an envelope without dismounting. From Mr. Danvers, ma'am, he said, urgent. She opened it before Colt had turned his horse. It was a single page. Bill Danvers' handwriting, but different from his usual business correspondence. Tighter, faster, the hand of someone writing in a hurry. Mrs. Graves, I am writing to inform you that the bank will not be pursuing the early call on your note. Your counter-assessment has been received and reviewed. We find no basis for further action under the appraisal clause. Your note remains in good standing through its original term of March. I would also ask to speak with you at your earliest convenience privately regarding a separate matter. I believe I owe you a conversation. W. Danvers. Eleanor read it twice. The note call was dead. Pruitt's instrument, the thing he'd built and paid for and arranged through the careful architecture of a donation and a clause and a cooperative appraiser, was gone. Dead before he'd had a chance to use it, killed by Sykes's report, and her counter-filing, and the signed receipt she'd gotten from a cheerful young teller named Clara who hadn't known what she was handling. She stood in the yard with the letter in her hand and felt the specific sensation of a weight leaving her body. Not all of it. Not yet. But the immediate weight, the March deadline, the 20% trigger, the counting of days lifted. She let herself feel it for exactly 30 seconds. Then she went inside and wrote 2 notes. One to Fred Marsh telling him the call had been withdrawn and asking his advice on whether the complaint filing should still proceed. One to Nathan telling him what had happened and asking him to come when he could. She sent Colt with both of them, with a coin for his trouble, and went back to work. Fred Marsh's response came back within the hour. File the complaint anyway. The call being withdrawn doesn't change what Pruitt did. The commission needs to know. Nathan arrived in the early afternoon. She showed him Danvers's letter. He read it and looked up, and the relief on his face was the most openly readable thing she'd seen from him. Not the managed quiet he usually carried, but something genuine and immediate. "It's over," he said. "The note call is over," Eleanor said. "Pruitt isn't." She told him about Fred's response. Nathan read it and nodded immediately. "File it." "It means making enemies," she said. "Pruitt will know it was me. He already suspects it, but filing the complaint makes it official. He'll know I went to the commission, and he'll know someone inside gave me information." She paused. "He'll figure out it was Mavis. Does Mavis know that—" "I'm going to ask her today." She went to the Danvers house in the mid-afternoon. Mavis answered the door looking like a woman who hadn't slept well and had made peace with that. "The note call was withdrawn," Eleanor said. Mavis closed her eyes briefly. "Oh, thank God. I want to file the fraud complaint with the banking commission. My attorney says the withdrawal doesn't change what happened." Eleanor held her gaze. "When Pruitt finds out, and he'll know someone with knowledge of the donation came forward. He'll figure out it was you." Mavis was quiet for a moment. She looked past Eleanor at the street, at the ordinary Monday life of Clearwater going on around them. "Bill came home Friday night," she said quietly, "after you filed the counter-assessment. He didn't say anything about it, but I could tell he knew the situation had changed." She paused. "He's a weak man, Eleanor. I've known that for a long time. He's not a bad man, but he's weak, and weak men around money make compromises they shouldn't." She looked at Eleanor directly. "He deserves to face what he enabled, and so does Gerald Pruitt." "Mavis." "File it," Mavis said. "I signed my name. I knew what I was signing." Eleanor came back from the Danvers house and drove straight to Fred Marsh, and they filed the complaint together, and Fred signed as the submitting attorney, and Eleanor signed as the complaining party, and the whole thing was sealed and addressed to the Territorial Banking Commission in Denver by 4 o'clock on a Monday afternoon. She drove home in the cold early dark with the filed complaint receipt in her coat pocket next to the letter from Pruitt about accidents in winter country, and the 2 pieces of paper felt like the whole shape of what this had been, the threat on one side, the answer on the other. Nathan was at her fence when she got home. She could tell from the way he was sitting on his horse that he'd been there a while patient, and still the way he was not going anywhere. She drove the wagon through the gate and stopped beside him. "It's filed," she said. He exhaled. Just once, just slowly. "Come inside," she said. "I'll tell you all of it." They sat at her kitchen table. Their table now, she thought, in the way that things became yours through use and repetition, and the accumulated weight of shared hours, and she told him everything. Mavis's face at the door. Fred's pen on the complaint. The receipt she carried. Nathan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at her across the table with an expression that she'd been cataloging for weeks now, the particular warmth of it, the steadiness, the way it managed to say several things at once, without any of them being pressure. "You did this," he said. "We did this." "No." His voice was gentle but definite. "I helped. You built it. You found the claws, you went to Marsh. You read the documents, you went to Mavis. He paused. I fixed a fence rail. Eleanor looked at him. You also sent for Sykes. That was one wire. Nathan. She said his name the way she'd learned to say it, without the guard she'd started with, without the careful distance she'd maintained for the first 2 weeks. Stop making yourself smaller than you are. He went quiet. His jaw moved slightly. I told you that in the beginning, she said. Don't make it smaller than it was. It goes both ways. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, All right. All right. She agreed. The lamp between them was steady. Outside, the wind had come up again, that winter wind she'd been sleeping alone against for 2 years, and tonight it still came and still moved through the eaves the way it always had. But the kitchen was warm, and she was not alone in it. Pruitt's going to move when the commission contact reaches him, she said, because there was still work to do, and she was a woman who did the work. He's going to look for another angle. Let him look, Nathan said. You've covered the ground. I've covered the ground I know about. She pulled her notepad closer. Tell me what ground I don't know about. He leaned forward. He put his elbows on the table. He started talking. They worked until the lamp needed refilling, and then Eleanor refilled it, and they kept working. 2 people at a table in a Colorado winter building, something out of documents and stubbornness, and the particular kind of trust that is earned one honest moment at a time. Gerald Pruitt had money and patience, and the practiced certainty of a man who had never once been stopped. Eleanor Graves had a counter-assessment, a signed statement, a filed complaint, a retired land lawyer, a man in Pueblo with 40 years of honest numbers, and the woman across the street who had stopped being quiet. And she had Nathan Hale, who fixed fence rails and asked what she needed and cooked beans and cornbread and sat across the table from her at 10 o'clock at night, helping her prepare for a fight that wasn't finished yet. She thought Pruitt was going to be surprised by what he'd underestimated. She picked up her pencil and kept working. The commission's response came faster than anyone expected. 8 days after Eleanor and Fred Marsh had sealed the complaint and sent it to Denver, a man arrived in Clearwater on the morning stage with a leather satchel, a territorial commission badge, and the particular expression of a government official who had read something troubling on the way and had questions. His name was Arthur Voss. He was neither young nor old, neither warm nor cold. He was the human equivalent of a well-maintained instrument, precise, and without personal investment in the outcome. He came to Eleanor's door first, which told her something about how the complaint had been received. She let him in. She put coffee on. She sat across the table from him and answered every question he asked with the same directness she'd given everything else in the past month. No embellishment, no softening, just the facts in the order they had happened. Voss took notes. He asked about the clause, the timing of the appraisal request, the Greer assessment, the Sykes counter-report. He asked about Mavis Danvers' statement. He asked how Eleanor had come to know about the donation. A neighbor told me, Eleanor said. A neighbor told another neighbor, and it reached me. Will your source testify to what she witnessed? She already signed a sworn statement. It's attached to the complaint. Voss looked at his notes. The bank withdrew the appraisal call before we received the complaint. Yes. That timing is interesting, he said, not to Eleanor particularly, just out loud. Bill Danvers received Sykes's counter-assessment on Saturday morning, Eleanor said. I suspect he understood immediately that the numbers didn't support the call and that proceeding would invite scrutiny he didn't want. She paused. He also asked to speak with me privately. He said he owed me a conversation. Voss looked up. Have you had that conversation? Not yet. I've been waiting to see which direction this went first. Voss wrote something. Eleanor watched his pen. She'd gotten very good at watching pens. I'll need to speak with Mr. Danvers, Voss said, and with Mr. Pruitt. I assumed you would. Mrs. Graves. He looked at her over his notes. I want to be clear about what this process is and isn't. The commission investigates. We don't prosecute. If we find the evidence supports the complaint, we refer the matter to the territorial attorney's office and make a formal finding. That finding becomes public record. I understand. A finding against a bank officer can result in his removal. A finding against a private party who influenced a bank officer can result in criminal referral. He paused. These are significant outcomes. Yes, Eleanor said. They are. He looked at her steadily. You understand that pursuing this to those outcomes will make permanent enemies of powerful people in this community. Eleanor looked back at him with the same steadiness. Mr. Voss, a powerful man in this community tried to use a fraudulent bank process to steal my land. He sent me an anonymous letter suggesting that accidents happen in winter country. She kept her voice level. I am not concerned about making him my enemy. He made himself mine. Voss was quiet for a moment. Then he wrote something in his notes, and Eleanor had the impression that whatever he wrote was not strictly procedural. I'll be in Clearwater through the end of the week, he said. Gerald Pruitt found out about Voss before noon. Eleanor didn't know how Clearwater was a small town, and small towns had their own telegraph system that operated faster and less officially than the actual one. But she knew he'd found out because Roy Lester came to her fence at 1 o'clock in the afternoon with the look of a man carrying hot information. Pruitt's furious, Roy said. I was at the feed store, and he came in and he was... Roy shook his head. I've never seen Gerald Pruitt lose his composure, not once in 20 years. What did he say? He said someone had gone behind his back to make lies into official business. He said it wouldn't stand. Roy looked at her carefully. Eleanor, he knows it was you. Of course he does. He's going to come for you. He's been coming for me for a year, Roy. She kept her voice even. The difference is that now I'm ready. Roy looked at her for a long moment at the steadiness in her, the particular quality of someone who has been afraid and gotten past it and arrived somewhere else. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite awe. Something more practical than that. What do you need? He said. She looked at him. Roy Lester, who ran the feed store and had been bringing her unsolicited advice for 2 years, asking the same question Nathan always asked. What do you need? Tell people the truth, she said. If they ask what's happening, tell them a woman filed a legal complaint because a man tried to take her land through a corrupt bank process. That's the truth. People can do what they want with it. Roy nodded slowly. All right, he said. All right, Eleanor. Pruitt came to her property that afternoon. He didn't send notice. He rode in through the front gate, through it not stopping at it, the way a man rides into land he believes is already his, and Eleanor was standing in the yard when he arrived, as if she'd known he was coming, which she had because she'd seen the dust from his horse while he was still half a mile out. He pulled up and looked down at her from the saddle with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. The patience was gone. The practiced generosity was gone. What was left was something harder and less managed. You want to tell me what you think you're doing, he said. I filed a complaint with the Territorial Banking Commission, Eleanor said, documenting that you made a payment to Clearwater Savings and Loan 6 weeks before requesting an appraisal action on my property. I imagine Mr. Voss has already told you that. That donation was a charitable contribution to a building fund. Yes, paid 6 weeks before you asked the bank to find grounds to call my note early. She held his gaze. The timing is what it is, Gerald. Pruitt's jaw was tight. You have no proof of any arrangement. I have a sworn statement from a witness who heard the conversation in Bill Danvers's study. She paused. A witness whose name is on a signed document that is currently in Arthur Voss's satchel. Something moved through Pruitt's expression, fast, sharp, and gone. He had not known about the signed statement. She could see the moment of recalculation, the reassessment of what he was facing. Whoever told you that is lying, he said. Then you'll have the opportunity to say so to the commission. Eleanor. He shifted, the weight of his voice dropped. It made it quieter, made it the voice of a man making a final reasonable offer. I am prepared to settle this quietly. The building fund donation returns to me. The complaint is withdrawn, and I make you an offer on this property that is fair, genuinely fair. You walk away with enough to start over comfortably." She looked at him. This was the offer. The real one, stripped of the architecture of legal maneuvering, just the plain transaction at the center of everything. Your silence for my money. Your land for your comfort. "No," she said. "Be sensible." "I am being sensible." Her voice was completely level. "You tried to take my land through a corrupt process, and then sent me an anonymous letter implying my neighbor might have a winter accident. I am being entirely sensible. The answer is no. The complaint stands. Mr. Voss will speak to whoever he needs to speak to, and the commission will find whatever it finds." Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. The calculation behind his eyes was visible now in a way it hadn't been before. She could see him running the numbers, assessing what he had, and what she had, and what the outcomes were. She watched him arrive at the answer. He turned his horse and rode out. Eleanor stood in the yard until the sound of his horse faded completely. Then she let out the breath she'd been holding for the last 4 minutes. Her hands were shaking. She put them in her coat pockets, where no one could see, and walked back to the barn. Nathan arrived an hour later. She was still in the barn, doing the kind of mechanical work that kept hands busy, while minds processed cleaning tack, checking, harness tasks that required just enough attention to crowd out everything else. She heard his horse and came out and looked at his face and said, "Pruitt was here?" "I know. I passed him on the road." Nathan got down from his horse. He looked like a man who'd had a door closed in his face. He made a final offer. What did he offer? Everything I could start over with, somewhere else. She looked at the fence line, at the land around her, at the visible extent of what she'd spent 2 years holding. He wanted the complaint withdrawn. And I said no. She met Nathan's eyes. Did I do the right thing? It was the first time she'd asked him that. Not what do I need, not what do you think, but did I do the right thing? She watched him understand the weight of the question. Yes, he said. Without hesitation and without inflation. Just yes. She nodded. Good, because I'm not changing it. He almost smiled. No, I didn't think you were. Voss spent 3 days in Clearwater. He spoke to Bill Danvers on Wednesday morning behind the closed door of the bank office for 2 hours. Eleanor didn't know what was said in that room. She knew that Danvers came out of it looking like a man who had set down something heavy he'd been carrying too long, and that the first thing he did afterward was walk across the street to Agnes Colton's dry goods store and spend 20 minutes talking to Agnes, who that evening told Eleanor through Roy that Danvers had confirmed the donation, confirmed the conversation in his study, and confirmed the timeline. He had told the truth. Eleanor sat with that for a while. A weak man who'd made a bad compromise, deciding in the end to stop compounding it. She thought about what Mavis had said. He's not a bad man, but he's weak. She thought about all the ways that weakness and badness were different things, and how the difference mattered, and how it also didn't completely excuse anything. Voss spoke to Pruitt on Thursday afternoon. Eleanor didn't witness that either, but Roy did, or at least saw it from the feed store window, which gave him the exterior of the meeting, if not the substance. He reported to Eleanor that Pruitt had arrived at the hotel where Voss was staying with his lawyer, a man who'd ridden up from Pueblo, which told Eleanor that Pruitt had known this was coming and had had time to prepare. That worried her for about 4 hours. Then Fred Marsh came to her door Friday morning and said, "Voss sent his preliminary findings to Denver last night. I have a contact at the commission who was willing to tell me the direction." Eleanor held the door open. "Come in." Fred sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd laid out documents and made plans, and drunk coffee gone cold, and worked late into winter evenings, and he put his hands flat on the surface and looked at her. "The preliminary finding supports the complaint," he said. "The commission is referring the matter to the territorial attorney's office for review of potential criminal liability. Pruitt's attorney will almost certainly negotiate a resolution before it gets to prosecution." But the finding itself, the official finding that Gerald Pruitt improperly influenced a bank officer in a matter affecting your property, that goes into the public record regardless. Eleanor sat down. "What does that mean for the bank?" she said. "Danvers cooperated with the investigation. The commission is recommending oversight rather than action contingent on his cooperation continuing." Fred paused. "Danvers also, I'm told, has agreed to return Pruitt's donation to Pruitt. The building fund contribution is being unwound. And the note, my note, remains in good standing. Original terms, March maturity." He looked at her. "Which you will be able to meet." Eleanor looked at the table. The arithmetic had changed shape so many times in the past month, from impossible to desperate to possible to this. She ran it one more time in her head. 14 cattle spring prices. The south parcel she could now keep the east pasture with its repaired trough feeding good grass through to calving season. It worked. The math worked. For the first time in 2 years, it actually worked. "Eleanor," Fred said. "You won." She looked up at him. The word felt strange, not wrong, but strange like a coat she hadn't worn in so long she'd forgotten the fit. "We won," she said. "You Sykes Mavis. Nathan." Fred shook his head slightly. "We helped. You built it." After he left, Eleanor sat at the table alone for a long time. The lamp was burning, though it was mid-morning, and she didn't need it, and she realized she'd lit it out of habit. The habit of working by lamplight through the dark hours, and she looked at the unnecessary flame and felt something move through her that was too complicated to name all at once. Relief. Exhaustion. The specific ache of attention held so long that releasing it was almost painful. And underneath all of it, quieter than the rest, but more durable, something that felt like ground. Solid ground. The feeling of standing on something that wasn't going to be taken from her. She got up and went outside. The commission's formal finding arrived by mail 10 days later, the same week that word went around Clearwater that Gerald Pruitt had reached a negotiated resolution with the territorial attorney's office. The terms undisclosed, his lawyer tight-lipped Pruitt himself conspicuously absent from the social geography of the town for the better part of 2 weeks. Eleanor read the formal finding at her kitchen table. She read every word of it as she read every word of everything now. It was precise and dry and official, the language of a document that would sit in a government archive for decades. And it said in the measured vocabulary of bureaucratic record that Gerald Pruitt had engaged in improper influence of a banking officer in a matter concerning the property of Eleanor M. Graves, and that this finding constituted a permanent mark on his commercial record in the territory of Colorado. She folded it and put it with the other documents. The Sykes assessment, the counterfiling receipt, the letter from Danvers Mavis's signed statement. The complete record of the past 6 weeks. Then she went to tell Nathan. He was working his cattle when she arrived. She could hear him before she could see him. The sound of a man who knew what he was doing, and did it without waste. She tied her horse at his fence and let herself through the gate, which she did now, without waiting to be invited. Because somewhere in the past weeks, that had changed, and neither of them had made a point of saying so. He saw her coming and read her face before she was close enough to speak. "It's done," he said. "It's done." He stood still for a moment. The cattle moved around him with the profound indifference of animals who didn't track human drama. He looked at Eleanor, really looked at her the way he had from almost the beginning. That straight, undefended attention. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about that honestly. "Like I've been carrying something very heavy for a very long time," she said, "and I just put it down. And my arms don't know what to do yet." He nodded. He understood that. She knew he did. "Come have coffee," he said. "Nathan?" She stopped him. He turned. She looked at him in the clear, cold December light. This man who had arrived at exactly the wrong moment and had somehow become the right thing. This quiet rancher who had sat beside her instead of standing over her and had asked what she needed instead of deciding what she owed him. "I want to say something. Just once, clearly." He waited. "I was wrong about what help meant," she said. I'd decided that help was always a trap, that anyone who offered it wanted something I wasn't willing to give. She kept his eyes. You changed that. Not because you were perfect, because you were consistent. You showed up the same way every time, and you never changed what you were based on what I gave back. She paused. I don't know how to do this yet. Whatever this is. I'm still learning the difference between needing someone and trusting someone, and those two things got broken in me, and I'm still fixing them. Nathan's expression was the most open she'd ever seen it. I know, he said quietly. I'm not in a hurry. I'm not asking you to wait for something that might not... Eleanor. His voice was gentle and absolutely firm. I'm not waiting. I'm here. Those are different things. She looked at him. The December cold moved around them both. I know, she said. That's what I'm trying to say. That I know the difference now, between someone who's here and someone who's waiting to collect. He crossed the distance between them. Not fast, not hesitant, just direct. And she didn't step back. And when he put his arms around her, it was the most straightforward thing in the world. The most ordinary, extraordinary thing. Two people who had each spent years being alone, deciding without ceremony to stop. She pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed. Just breathed. The cold air and the smell of horses and pine and work, and the specific warmth of another person who had chosen to be exactly where they were. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying alone in the dark, the private kind that no one saw, and this wasn't that. This was something else. This was the other side of it, what you got to when you'd done the crying and kept going and built something out of the wreckage and refused to let anyone take it. She stood there for a long moment. Then she pulled back and looked at him. Coffee, she said. He almost fully smiled. Coffee. They told no one. There was nothing to tell. Exactly no announcement, no event. Just the gradual visible fact of two people who had begun to orbit each other and had stopped pretending otherwise. Clearwater noticed the way Clearwater always noticed things, not all at once, but incrementally, the way a season changes, and by Christmas the general consensus had formed without anyone needing to state it directly. Agnes Colton told Roy Lester that she'd seen it coming from the first week Nathan Hale had ridden past Eleanor's fence. Roy said he doubted it. Agnes gave him the look she gave people when they said things she found improbable. Mavis Danvers said nothing to anyone. But when she passed Eleanor on the street 2 weeks before Christmas, she looked at her with an expression that was not congratulation. Exactly, but was adjacent to it the look of a woman who had taken a risk, and was watching it have turned out to mean something. Bill Danvers had resigned from the bank the week after Voss's visit. He'd told Agnes, who told everyone eventually, that he'd decided to sell insurance, which was a business where what he did was entirely clear, and no one could make private arrangements about it without him knowing. Agnes thought this was probably the most self-aware thing Bill Danvers had said in 30 years of marriage. Mavis, when this was reported to her, said simply, maybe. Fred Marsh charged Eleanor $40 for his legal work, and told her he'd enjoyed himself more than he had in years, and to come see him if anyone gave her trouble. She paid him, shook his hand, and meant every word of her thank you. Robert Sykes sent a note from Pueblo saying the Graves counter-assessment was the cleanest case he'd worked in a decade, and he hoped her spring calving went well. Gerald Pruitt was not seen in Clearwater for the rest of that winter. Whether he'd left entirely or simply retreated was unclear. What was clear was that he no longer attended town council meetings, or stood at the bar at the saloon talking about which properties in the county represented opportunity. His name stopped being said the way it had been said with the particular deference people gave to men with money and forward momentum. The finding in the commission record had done what Fred Marsh said it would do. It had made his name into a document, and documents lasted longer than reputations. Eleanor didn't think about him much. She had other things to think about. In late January, when the hardest part of the winter had settled in, and the days were short, and the work was the ongoing unglamorous labor of keeping animals alive, and fences standing, and ground productive, Eleanor stood at her kitchen window one morning before dawn and looked at the dark shape of her land and took its measure. 14 cattle. A repaired barn. a solid north fence and a functioning east trough, and a tack room roof that no longer leaked. A note coming due in March that the numbers now covered. A spring calving season that would, if it went reasonably well, put her 15 head up from where she'd started. Not abundance, not ease, but ground. Her ground with her name on the deed, with no one's signature on anything she hadn't read completely and understood fully and chosen freely. She heard Nathan's wagon on the road he'd been coming for supper 3 nights a week since December, and sometimes on the other nights too, and they'd stopped tracking which was which, and she went to put the kettle on. He came through her door the way he always did, without performance, without agenda, in the practical and inhabited way of a man who had found a place that was not his and had been invited into it and understood exactly what that meant and what it didn't. He set something on the table. She looked at it. It was a small box, plain wood, the kind you kept papers in. "What's that?" she said. "Open it." She opened it. Inside were folded documents, the deed to the Kavanaugh property, a survey map, a handwritten list that she recognized after a moment as a property inventory. His property. Everything that was his on paper in her hands. She looked up. "I'm not giving it to you," he said. "I'm showing you." He held her gaze. "I have nothing I'm hiding in paperwork. Everything I own is in that box. You can read all of it. I want you to." He paused. "Because you should always know what the person beside you holds, and I want you to know what I hold, and I want you to know it's clean." Eleanor looked down at the box, at the documents that represented everything he'd built since Wyoming, since the dissolution that had cost him half of what he'd worked for, since he'd started over with Robert Sykes's honest numbers and his own 2 hands. She put the lid back on the box carefully. She looked at him. "I'll read them," she said. "Tonight." "All right. And then—" She stopped. She started again. "And then I want to show you mine. Everything. The full picture. Not because I need you to fix anything. Because you're right. The person beside you should know what you hold." Nathan was quiet for a moment. The kettle began to sound. "Okay," he said. "Just that. Just okay." Eleanor took the kettle off and poured the water and set the cups on the table and sat down, and Nathan sat across from her, and the box of his documents sat between them like something honest and uncomplicated, which was exactly what it was. Outside, the January dark was still complete. The ranch was quiet around them, the particular quiet of winter, of things enduring, of ground that had been fought for and held, and would still be there when the thaw came. Eleanor Graves had come through the worst 2 years of her life. She had lost her husband and discovered his debts, and almost lost her land, and found her own courage, and fought a man with money, and won. She had learned that paperwork was power, and that help was not always a trap, and that silence between 2 people could be the most honest form of conversation. She had not been rescued. She had not been saved. She had been met by a man who sat beside her instead of over her, who asked what she needed instead of deciding what she owed, who showed her his documents and asked to see hers, and called that the beginning of something real, and in a town that had predicted her failure, watched her refusals, and waited for her collapse. Eleanor Graves sat at her kitchen table in the last dark of a January morning with her land under her feet and her name on the deed, and a man across the table whose arms had felt like the simplest thing in the world. She hadn't just survived alone. She had survived long enough, and stubbornly enough, and honestly enough to finally understand what she actually deserved.